There was huge news over the weekend. Former President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt at a Pennsylvania rally. We're still waiting to learn more information about the motive of the shooter, but right away we saw political leaders respond to the news. What are leaders in Michigan saying?
Well, for starters, there was broad condemnation of political violence across the spectrum, Republican, Democrat, what have you, as well as prayers for Donald Trump's recovery. So it pretty much shook out exactly as you'd expect. Yesterday, Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued a statement urging all Americans to, quote, turn down the heat of the political discourse in our country. So it's pretty much just been a sentiment of this was a rather tumultuous Saturday. This was a level of widespread panic for a potential presidential assassination we haven't seen in some time. And many political leaders are saying it's time to reach a cooling off point.
And President Biden also spoke yesterday saying essentially the same thing for having a cooling off point. Do we expect any news coming out of the Republican National Convention this week?
I mean, I guess anything's possible. Trump is expected to get the Republican nominee this week, and we will just have to stay tuned. The FBI is still digging into the shooter's motives at this point, and we don't have much to report on that front.
Gotcha. The shooting is a huge deal, and it's something we're going to continue to follow. At the same time, leaders acknowledge that the campaign season hasn't stopped and won't stop. Before the shooting happened on Friday, President Joe Biden was in town in Detroit. What did he tell voters?
Yeah, so I think it's important to acknowledge the sort of historical arc here. 4 years ago, President Biden had appeared as a candidate in Renaissance High School right before the onset of COVID. And so to see how things have developed in the ensuing 4 years was really mind-blowing. But Lauren Gibbons was at that rally. And this was also a marked difference from what we saw 4 years ago. We saw a chance of lock him up in reference to former President Trump. Biden booed the press, but at the same time, we also had general stump material talking about protections for abortions, lowering prescription drugs, the things that you'd expect out of conventional presidential speech in an election year. But at the same time, this is anything but. And there's been calls for Biden to end his campaign. And as a result, he's fighting back against that. We heard chants of don't give up from the crowd. They were there to support him. But at the same time, he's confident. He's telling people, I'm going to win despite some of these calls. And he has expressed no intention of trying to leave the race. And of course, it's important to note that this was a speech delivered via teleprompter. And so that's prepared remarks. And he's done a really good job of hitting the mark when he's giving these teleprompted speeches. And it's a marked difference as well from what you hear in improvised remarks, which are some of the things that have given people the most concern.
Are Democrats increasingly parting with Biden?
Yeah, so this is something that is literally changing hour by hour. I think that there's sort of been a steady but slowly growing chorus of voices that were saying that they're interested in having another candidate in the race. Hillary Scholten was that first candidate from the congressional delegation to do that. But there's been also some calls at the state level to have that happen, like from State Representative Phil Skaggs, for example, although there have been other state legislators who are backing the president. But at the same time, the events over the past weekend, these enormous monumental events, have completely changed the focus of the race and the narrative, and it seems to have put some of those conversations on ice for the time being. And so whether that's going to ultimately help or harm some of this fracture within the party since the debate, I think remains to be seen. It's going to be a question of how long that pause in these calls lasts and whether it represents a successful pivot away from those conversations, given these, historic events.
For sure. And that's something that we're going to continue to keep our eyes on, is the tone and the tenor of the campaign is going to change. We had a report over the weekend about how divided the community in the country is or isn't. And some of the results might surprise you. You can find that information at our website, bridgemi.com. Jordyn, we had a lot of readers ask questions about Project 2025. Can we start big picture? What is Project 2025?
Yeah, so it's a four-pronged transition project for the next Republican president, who's likely going to be Donald Trump, as we just discussed. It's headed by the Heritage Foundation, which has had historical precedent for forming these kinds of policy documents. And when people talk about Project 2025, they're mostly specifically talking about a nearly 1,000-page policy document that calls for a litany of reforms on education, immigration, religious liberties, and more. It's effectively a policy wish list. For instance, the last time the Heritage Foundation was pretty deeply involved in crafting a document of this level prior to the contract with America from Newt Gingrich in the 90s. In the 80s, they were also involved in a similar effort with President Ronald Reagan, and they estimate they got about 60% of the policy wishes that they wanted completed through that. Granted, that is the policy authors saying that, so grain of salt, but there is some past wisdom to suggest that this is a kind of policy agenda that we could potentially this November.
And it covers a lot of different things. I think it's like over 900 pages long, if I'm not mistaken. We had a reader who asked specifically about women's rights and abortion access. What does Project 2025 say about women's rights?
So there were two big takeaways when I looked through the document with respect to women's rights, specifically with respect to cracking down on abortion. There's a portion of the policy agenda that calls for enacting a dormant law at the federal level. It's called the Comstock Act, and it would effectively ban the mailing of any medication that induces abortion. And these kinds of federal laws would supersede what we have on the books here in Michigan. So despite the fact that Michigan approved and codified the right to an abortion in its state constitution a few years ago, this would supersede that act. There's also calls to have the FDA rescind its approval of a abortion-inducing drug known as mifepristone, excuse me. And it's important to note that that was actually used in half of all of Michigan's abortions in 2022. So it could have significant implications if we do end up seeing this enacted. To say nothing of, if you want to go down the rabbit hole a little further with respect to women's rights, there's also a number of places where LGBT rights are called for to be rolled back. So that would not only affect lesbian women specifically, but also transgender women as well.
Thank you for that. And your report on our website has more details on what Project 2025 could mean for both the nation and Michigan. We've also gotten several questions about how Bridge and the media in general choose what to cover. Obviously, there's both Trump and Biden. How do journalists decide when to focus on Biden versus Trump? Simon?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the news business, we always do have a bias towards covering what new developments are in the race, especially when you're covering multiple rallies at a time. Speaking from my individual perspective, you're going to hear what is referred to as stump material a lot of the time, just sort of boilerplate conversations that make their way into every speech that a candidate makes, because that's really important for whipping up votes and encouraging your base to come out and support you. At the same time, that's generally something that we're not going to talk about duplicatively. We're going to instead look at how a candidate addresses current events and, you know, moves the narrative forward in terms of how the presidential race is developing, because we cannot necessarily, it's not an enjoying thing for readers to essentially read the same things over and over again if we just have a secretarial list of all of the things that someone says in a given speech. So a candidate's appearances or prominent surrogates' appearances are also important, talking about the ways candidates and campaigns themselves strategize and move forward and look to reach out to voters is pretty integral to our coverage as well, and especially the issues that they're going to campaign upon. So it's kind of incumbent upon candidates to have a presence on the campaign trail, have individuals that are going out and making points, and then also at the same time really advertising what their stances are. And if they don't do that, it becomes a lot harder for us to do our jobs.
Yeah, I think narrowing it down to scope of the affected. So, you know, we are a Michigan publication. We will focus a lot on Michigan specific issues or figuring out a way to localize federal issues to Michigan readers, as well as the likelihood of what we're covering, whether or not it will become policy or become enacted. Obviously, there's a lot of news out there. You read a lot online every day, but not everything is true or feasible to happen. So we do go through a pretty sincere vetting process of making sure that we get the news to you that is most likely to impact your lives and the lives of other Michiganders.
Which is exactly why we do things like this. We want to make sure that what we're reporting on is stuff you care about, is stuff you have questions about, and that we're providing a public service. A reader asked, Mike Rogers is the Republican frontrunner for the U.S. Senate seat. How can he have any chance of winning when he has been critical of Trump in the past?
It's a great question. I think the way elected officials have negotiated their relationships with the former president have been really key in elections. It can make or break individuals, especially at the primary stage. But I think President Trump as well is not someone who's immovable and has some sort of flexibility if he hears from the right people and can be convinced that a former critic of his is worth supporting. And this is the case with Mike Rogers because he received Trump's endorsement. And That sort of shows that there's water under the bridge between the two individuals, but also a tacit agreement that Mike Rogers is not going to be a critic of the president during the election season. And so maintaining that camaraderie, or at least that alliance throughout the campaign, is going to be really important for him. And so while I think a lot of people, especially loyalists and adherents to President Trump, are going to focus on that, given that he has the president's endorsement, it's going to be a lot harder for his competitors to reach out and say, hey, look at his track record, look at the things he said in the past, because that requires a lot of money, and then you have to be able to fundraise to do that.
Well, and Trump isn't stupid too. I mean, there needs to be a Republican candidate, and Mike Rogers has positioned himself as the most likely candidate to take on potentially Alyssa Slotkin for the U.S. Senate race. And so, you know, you would rather back a candidate of your own party, correct, than, you know, shoot yourself in the foot. So he's not dumb. And this coalition, or I'm sorry, coalescence behind Mike Rogers is necessary if Republicans want to take the Senate seat come November.
Yeah, more than anything else, Trump does like a winner.
Political reality right there. And then we had a reader, David, who asked, who will replace Tim Sneller?
Oh, that's a great question, and something that I think a lot of people are still working through right now. I think this was sort of an unexpected development in this particular legislative race, and there is not going to be any names, to my understanding, on the August 6th primary ballot to replace him. Don't hold me to this 100%, but it seems like the most feasible path forward for Democrats at this point is a write-in candidate to face Republican state rep Dave Martin. And so, but that's going to require not just finding a candidate who's really interested in running and well positioned to do so, but also can get the signatures to get on the ballot, and then can raise the money necessary to mount a feasible write-in campaign. And that's a tall ask, especially when going up against an incumbent state legislator in a close election season such as this. So it's going to be interesting to see who moves forward to replace the late rep.
And it's important, we also have an elections tracker that we update every single day of the week with any sort of news about the upcoming election or the upcoming primary. So that's a great place to check for additional resources as well. We appreciate you all being here today, especially with those technical difficulties. I want to add one more question to the mix. Simon and Jordyn, what's one thing each that you are looking for on the campaign trail this week?
I'm curious to see what comes out of the RNC this week, frankly. I mean, with the attempt on former over the weekend, and there's been a lot of speculation on this, that national rhetoric could go any sort of which way, and that what happened on Saturday is a election defining moment. It's a country defining moment. And so I'm just going to be keeping my eye on moving forward, especially this week, what to expect out of Republicans, what we're going to hear out of Democrats, and how it could affect this race moving forward.
Yeah, I have to agree with Jordyn. That is something that I'm also very interested to see about. But I'm also interested in the rhetoric from Democrats as well as Republicans. You know, there was a pivot towards talking about unity. President Trump has not come out with strong partisan rhetoric since this assassination attempt on him. And I'm curious how long that's going to last, if it will last through the entirety of the Republican convention. And more pointedly, given the speaker lineup at this convention, whether they're going to incorporate any of that rhetoric, or is this going to be usual programming? Or is there going to be a maintained pivot towards unity, and how that's going to impact this campaign moving forward? And at the same time, is that going to effectively silence the calls for Democrats for Biden to exit the race and for Democrats to nominate a new candidate? Is that something that's been put to bed by all these developments? That's something I'm really interested to see as well, especially in Michigan.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for your time on this. And thank you everyone for being here today. If you submitted a question and we didn't get to it, we will take it under advisement and look at story ideas for those things. We are appreciative of you being here. Our mission is to make Michigan a better place through our nonprofit journalism. If you have a question for our reporters, you can submit the question on our website, bridgemi.com. Our website also has our free Politics Watch newsletter as well as our regularly updated elections tracker. If you want even more news, you know where to find us at our website. And we are so appreciative of you being here. Thank you and have a great week.